Today on the MedicalSalesU podcast, we are joined by Rachel Caton, an endoluminal sales rep of the year in the capital equipment and the robotics space at one of the largest companies. Rachel has built her career in highly competitive clinical sales environments, and she has progressed from being an associate. She's moved up to capital sales leadership. She won Sales Rep of the Year. Rachel, welcome to MedicalSalesU.
Thanks so much for having me.
Rachel, one of our members, I tell our members, if they're going out for a position, don't just apply. Don't just work on your resume. Mm-hmm. You have to network. And every now and then, one of my members of our program, we have people trying to break in. They'll come back and be like, this person was so helpful and they're successful. They've been promoted multiple times. And that's what happened. One of our guys reached out to me, Micah, and I was asking him, like, who are you networking with? Who are you talking to? And your name came up as someone who was successful. So great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, when I first started, I did the same exact thing, reaching out to people on LinkedIn. So I'm always happy to help.
Well, let's start here. For people that are not familiar with endoluminal capital sales, what does your role actually look like?
Yeah, so capital selling, I didn't initially start with that in my medical device career, but you're the one who has the opportunity to work with hospitals on actually acquiring the technology. And so I'm the kind of first person that enters the four walls of the hospital. They get introduced to the equipment, and then a clinical person is ultimately the representative that will launch the program and train the physicians. So it's a little bit different from the clinical side of things.
And it's different from disposables. I mean, talk to us a little bit about, why do you love capital sales? What is it about this role that you enjoy?
Yeah, so I knew pretty early on that capital was what I wanted to eventually get to. And it was partially because what really motivates me is the impact of medical device sales. And so with capital, you're able to place systems in communities that sometimes never had access to life-saving and life-changing technology. And so it's really cool to walk into a small city in the Midwest that doesn't have access to something, and you're the first person that introduces them to it.
When you're a part of this, tell us, what is and I know you can't give us specifics, but what does that sales cycle look like? Who are the people that you're talking to, and how long does it take? Because you're talking about a small town in the Midwest. For these decisions to be made, what does that look like? Because there's some people are like, the sales cycle's too long. Tell us just just an overview of what that looks like.
Yeah, I think I've been fortunate enough to be trained pretty well in the capital side of things. And it all depends on how much your customer sees value in what you're offering them. And so I've seen capital processes take as short as a month or 2 months to going on for a year or two. And it really all comes down to one thing, and it's how important does the customer or hospital think that your product is to them. And so I typically always start with the physician, or really anyone who will listen. So I'm in the oncology space, and sometimes it's not always the end user who's going to be your person who champions the product. Sometimes it's someone who sees the patients in clinic after the fact, and they see that there's a better way to do something. And so I would say it all really comes down to the fact of, how are you inspiring someone to think that they need this now, not in a year from now?
What do you do? How are you, in your personality, your skill sets, what do you do to inspire, to reach the right people, to connect, to show the value? Because I have people who want to break into this, and they're like, well, I'm applying to jobs, I'm interested in this, or maybe they're already in the field and they are average. They're not like you. You are number one at a large, well-respected company. What do you do to inspire them?
I think it comes down to just how humans operate. I mean, whenever we decide something in life, it's based off of what are our core values. And so physicians aren't any different from us. They think about, how do I make sure that I'm providing the best quality care to the community that I serve? And so when I enter into a hospital, I make sure to go back to that. Sometimes I ask the question, why did you get into this space? Why are you in the oncology realm of medicine? And a lot of times they share, a family story or someone close to them that was personally impacted by cancer or whatever the product is. And that's where you really carry that one story through the whole sales process. So they tell you about their mom. I just had a situation the other day where someone's former boss at the hospital had passed away from the cancer that our product helps treat. And so we just carried that story through, and that's what motivates people. It's a personal story. And so I think a lot of times in sales, people forget that if someone's meeting with you, it needs to matter to them, not to you, why they need the product.
I like that. There's always something personal. And sometimes for our members who are trying to get into this industry, they may think, well, I haven't heard enough stories, or I don't know enough. And those stories will come if we listen, if we pay attention. And I think that is something that makes us relatable, both as a rep, you certainly do, and also for the person who's wanting to advance their career. I know, for example, if you would have asked me years ago if I would have gone into oncology, I would have been like, no, I have no interest. I don't even have a passion for this. But the more I started thinking about it, I'm like, well, I do. I lost my grandfather to lung cancer. I lost my uncle to lung cancer. And then my wife, her mom, who was a non-smoker, died of lung cancer, even though she never smoked. And back then, the technology, it was not detected early, right? And there was not, all patients were treated the same. Now we have, and so for my last role at Johnson & Johnson, it was a targeted treatment for a mutation called EGFR that shows up in non-small cell lung cancer patients, but also it shows up in women, it shows up with non-smokers. And so now I had a story to tell, right? I had something to relate to them about this. And that story was not always with me, right, in our positions, but I always tell people breaking in to observe, to listen. It may not be your story, but if you're in sales, it may not be the doctor, but it may be a nurse, it may be a manager, it may be a NP who has something that you can leverage that and empathize with them, but then connect that to someone else. Okay, now let's hear your story, okay? Rachel, you went to, talk to us about college. Freshman in college, what were you thinking you were going to do? And then from the time, it looks like you went to Elon and then Liberty University, where I went. Tell us how your whole college experience, what did you think you were going to do? And how did you get into this field?
Yeah, so it's funny. I actually wasn't certain if college really was for me at one point. I was, eager to get into the workforce, and I was not totally certain what my degree should be, but I knew that growing up, I was always genuinely interested in all things medicine. And so that started with public health at Elon University. Then it transitioned to exercise science, which I ultimately graduated with. But I was toying with all these ideas of, do I want to do physical therapy? Do I want to do personal training? Do I want to be a nutritionist, a chiropractor? And none of that seemed like it completely fit my personality. And so I was fortunate enough, I might be getting ahead of myself, but fortunate enough to be in a class with someone who ended up going into medical device sales. And so I'll pause there, but yeah, I definitely knew something medical was where I wanted to head.
I want to hear that story. You were in a class with someone who got into medical sales. Tell us more.
Yeah, so I had an internship in New York City, which was around nutrition and physical therapy. And I had to admit that when I was shadowing those people, even the chiropractor told me, hey, I don't recommend going into being a chiropractor anymore. Physical therapy, I felt like it was repetitive. Nothing wrong with those industries, but I knew that there was something about my strengths and skill set that needed to be showcased somewhere else. And so I actually had a couple women in New York City who recommended the book Lean In, which was all about young women leaning into their career. And so that kind of opened up, do I want to go into something like business? And I was trying to look up his name, but he was in my class at Liberty. And I noticed on his LinkedIn that he had pivoted into something called medical device sales. And he was at, I believe, Zimmer Biomet. And I reached out to him and I was like, do you like this? And he said, I absolutely love it. And so from that point on, I felt like it was the perfect blend between my passion, which was medical side of things, and then having that sales business piece of my personality.
That's so good. The last thing you told me is that you reached out to him on LinkedIn. Can you repeat that last part again?
Yeah. So I had noticed on LinkedIn that he went to Zimmer Biomet. And I just sent him a quick message saying, I don't know if you remember me, we were in the same classes. How are you liking that career step? And we talked on the phone. He told me how he got into medical device. And the minute he started describing the role, I knew that that was what I wanted to be in.
I love what you did there. You became an observer on his LinkedIn page. You noticed the company he was with. You sent him a message, and then you related with him. Hey, I don't know if you remember me from Liberty. And here's the key. It's like I tell our members in our program at MedicalSalesU, they're wanting to break in. We coach our members, look, don't send a long-winded email about yourself. Just become a great observer. Notice something about them. And that's exactly what you did. You noticed the product, the company, and then you just ask, how do you like it? And then you close on a phone call. You got on the phone with them and you're able to hear more. And then that's when you knew that you wanted to be in it, right?
Definitely.
Okay. So what was your first opportunity to actually break in?
Yeah, so it was a funny story. I mean, I told the member from your group about this. I reached out to 20 medical device companies, anyone who would talk to me. I mean, I would get coffee with them. I would ask them to look at my resume, any connection I could make in the field. And so ultimately there was a small distributorship in Maryland, which I originally was from. And they were going back and forth. And I'll never forget, there was a story where they had offered me to come on a field ride to go into the OR with them. It was ortho trauma. And I thought that meant that I got the job. So I sent them an email saying, oh, thank you so much for offering me the role. I'm so excited. And they were like, you haven't actually been offered the position yet. So that was a funny story, but that's where I ultimately transitioned into was ortho trauma.
You've mentioned several funny things there. One is in the device space is the whole idea of a field ride, right? Like this is often relationally based and it's not allowed in pharma. But in device, I tell our members, like as you're connecting with these reps, especially a smaller company as well, and every company has their own culture and roles. But if you can do a field ride, that means you actually ride along with them and you shadow them in the operating room, and you're just standing there. You're observing what it's like. What was it like on that first field ride?
I remember being really nervous. Two things. So I showed up in a full suit for the case, which, the rep shows up in their scrubs, which I do always recommend show up overly dressed for it. Don't show up in scrubs. But it was funny because he was like, you're going to immediately change into scrubs. But I was pretty nervous because I wasn't certain how I was going to react. It was a trauma case with ortho. And so I was a little nervous, but once I went into the procedure, I noticed kind of how relaxed it was, but still the rep had to demonstrate quite a bit of professionalism and confidence. And I just thought, wow, if you're able to go in and make an impact in a procedure and the surgeon relies on you like that, what a cool career path. And so definitely started with some nerves, but ended with even more excitement.
Being in trauma in ortho in that space, you mentioned that you were nervous, but at any moment, did it gross you out? Was there fears like that? Or were you pretty confident that, you know what, I think I can do this? What were you thinking?
I was nervous because the person interviewing me had told me that they had had someone prior that had, passed out in the OR. And so you're never in that type of situation in normal day life. And so I was curious how I was going to feel, but ultimately, it's such a sterile environment and everyone is there to accomplish one thing, which is making sure the patient has a good outcome. And so it really didn't feel like what I thought it was going to feel like. It felt like we were there to do a job, and all of the nervousness or any type of nausea or anything like that was not present. And so definitely something to be careful of going into it if that's a tendency for you. But
when you reach out to them originally, you're like, hey, thanks for the job. And they're like, you don't have it quite yet, but you do this field ride. When did you get the offer? How much later was it? Did you have to interview? much after that? Or were they like, you know what, Rachel, we got to give her this job? How did that look
Mhm.
like after that?
No, it was about a week after they had me cover my first cases with another rep, but it was Christmas Eve. And so that was kind of when I got my first introduction to ortho trauma was holidays. There is the potential that you're working on them. Weekends, you're sharing them with your team and being on call. And so I actually loved that aspect of the role. The the kind of emergent need of the procedures and how important you are in them. But that was definitely eye-opening that your life changed a lot in that space.
And with this opportunity, you got the job, they give you the offer. What was that like your first year?
I told myself, I'll never forget, I graduated early from college. So I was either just about to turn 21 or was 21. And I told myself, this is going to be the hardest year of my life. And I don't think it actually was, but I wanted to make sure that I said, I'm going to put in the hours. This first year is me proving myself to not just my current company, but any other rep that I come in contact with, that I am right for this role and that it's going to be the career that I stick with for the long term. And so, I took as much call as I possibly could. I, soaked up every connection that was possible in the hospitals, which ultimately was the reason why I then was able to pivot into my next role. And so I think I always tell people when they're associates or coming onto a medical device company and maybe they're a little bummed that they're not an immediately quota bearing rep, I'm like, that's such an awesome opportunity because that's your time to build your brand at the company. And that is something that is far more valuable than most people think.
The ability, the people that you'll meet, the surgeons, the other reps of other companies, building trust with your current, maybe you're an associate, but maybe it's the full-on rep who then gets an opportunity somewhere else. Eventually you get another opportunity. You may not be able to tell us all the specifics, but what was that like? Can you kind of paint a little bit of a picture for us?
Yeah. So I knew that I really wanted to make a big impact in changing, maybe an entire way of doing surgery or doing how current state is done. And so I'll never forget, I was with a GYN. And again, I always tell people too, like, be genuinely curious. Surgeons and physicians can tell when you actually care what they're talking about versus just, asking questions because you're trying to get to a specific answer. And so I had the opportunity to see a woman, a female surgeon, perform open hysterectomy and then do a minimally invasive hysterectomy. And when I saw the difference of what that meant for that patient, I was like, I have to be a part of that company. And so I was in that case, the minimally invasive one. And I asked the scrub tech, I said, who's your rep? And she gave me the name of the rep. And I said, do you have her cell phone number? They gave me her cell phone number. And I ultimately got coffee with her, and it didn't stop there. I LinkedIn messaged another guy at the company. He had gone to training with my future manager, and so all of these pieces of connecting was the sole reason I got my dream job. And I have kind of a funny story of that interview process, but yeah, that was how I got into.
Tell us a funny story. We want to hear it.
So I was in ortho trauma, obviously, and you're on call. So when your team needs you, you can't just say, hey, I've got an interview and I have to leave the case, right? You have to be there. And so the new company said, well, the director's in town. He's got 3-hour window to meet with you and to interview you. And I said, well, unfortunately, I'm on call, so I can't make that work. And they said, well, then that's really the only chance we have. I was a bit of an underdog in this process. So they kind of were like, well, we could just cut someone off our list. So I was really upset. I go to the hospital for my case. It cancels. And so I have my best friend look up who the director is, what he looks like on Facebook. I knew where they were doing the interviews. And I printed out my resume at the hospital. I had a nurse help me. I drive up to the hotel that he's at and I sit and watch him interview people, interview. And then he was getting up to leave. And I walk up to him and I say, I know I'm not on your docket to interview today, but I think you should give me a little bit of your time. And so ultimately that's how I got the job. And I think that's what it takes, is being really bold and eager to get in.
Beautiful story. You were faithful to your job. You were doing what you were supposed to do. And then you showed up persistent,
Mhm.
confident, printing out your resume, and it's just showing up. I think that's a encouragement to all of our audience here. If you had to look back to yourself when you were 21, or maybe even before that, when you're
Mhm.
still in college, what would you tell your 19-year-old, 20-year-old self? Would you do anything differently looking back? I know we can't change our past, but what would you advise
Mhm.
yourself?
I think don't ever count yourself out for anything. I felt like in college, you put yourself in bubbles, like maybe I'm not great at math and science. And so I'm going to lean away from that. Or maybe I'm not the most social person or outgoing. So that probably means I wouldn't be good at sales. I would say follow what you're really passionate about, and it'll make being successful easy. And so looking back, that was kind of my thing. I said, well, I'm not very good at math and science, so I'm going to stay away from the sciences. And uh, I'm like, man, you can do whatever you put your mind to. And so it's easy to count yourself out before you should.
One thing that stands out about your personality is that one, you take initiative, you're not afraid to talk to people, and also you like to work. I think earlier you mentioned that
Hmm.
you weren't even sure that you wanted to go to college. You might want to just start working.
Hmm.
When did you develop that work habit, like your work ethic? Did you have jobs in high school? What was that like? Was it instilled by your parents? How did you develop that strong work ethic?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think when I realized that work could be fun. And so I was a lifeguard growing up, and I thought it was a blast when you're surrounded by people that you enjoy working with. And so I would lifeguard during the day. And then what really taught me that I could be pretty good at sales was I was a bike taxi. And so I worked in downtown Annapolis and pedicabbed people around downtown. And I realized that there was a way to get someone who wasn't even considering getting on a bike to get on a bike and take a ride. And so it ended up being a lot of fun to convince people that you need a ride to the
How
restaurant
do you
you're
do
going
that?
to.
How do
And
you convince? What did you do? Just write up and say, "Hey, you need a ride," or what?
no, I mean, it would be, let's say it's a warm summer day, and I'd be like, hey, it looks like, it's hot out. Are you hot out? Are you hot? And they'd say, yeah, oh my gosh, it's disgusting out. And I'd be like, would it be nice if you could just, ride in the back and we get there and you're not sweaty showing up to dinner? And, you know, again, the connection of demonstrating there's a need, even if you don't think there's a need, and I have the solution. So,
Sales is in your DNA. You've continued to evolve. Tell us about a little bit more about capital sales. Now, you talked
mhm.
about trauma, early career. You're in the OR. What about now? Are you in the OR as much? What does your week look like? How do you plan it?
Mhm. No, so I'm not really in procedures anymore unless for various specific reasons. But no, so I am pretty strictly meeting with physicians, educating them on the product, and then we work together and I say, is this important to you to enough to go to your leadership team? And so once they say yes, I typically say then we need to go to your CEO, CFO, COO and talk to them about the project. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what I do is making sure that physicians believe and are inspired, and then we go to their leadership team and share with the leadership team how it would positively impact the hospital.
These are big decisions. How do you keep going
Hmm.
and managing your territory for that other rep who's not number one like you? Like you're number one, but
Hmm.
there's someone maybe who's struggling a little bit. They're towards the bottom and maybe they're discouraged or like, I've tried to access it. I keep getting denied. It's not in their budget, whatever reason. Um, how do you encourage that person? What do you do to stay motivated and keep working hard when you don't see an
Hmm.
immediate sale?
Yeah. So my boss always says, she says, performance is a lagging indicator of behaviors. And so, it was tough when I first started capital sales. I sold very little for the first 6 months. And you question yourself. You say, am I doing something wrong? Am I not good at this role? Should I go back to clinical or whatever, give up? And now capital takes about 6 months to build momentum anyways. And so it was going back to just the continuous question every day. Am I doing the behaviors that I know will push forward the business. And we know what those are. They're meetings with physicians, educating them on your product. They're market development activities like dinners and events where you bring in other physicians who are using your product. And so it was just making sure that you stayed true to the core of capital sales, which is a physician who's motivated to an executive who understands the value, and then driving them on a specific timeline. And so that is kind of how I just make sure that if I'm doing the right behaviors, I know that my performance will eventually demonstrate that.
You implement the habits, you have specific timelines, deadlines. And I think that's true with going after these opportunities and getting a job as well. We have to have deadlines. Yeah. And if we do those things and execute, the results will follow. Okay, now it's fun, it's personal, it's growth. Let's just ask you a couple of these questions. What's one habit that has helped you grow the most professionally? Maybe one thing we haven't talked about, one other habit.
I think maintaining some level of balance. And so you do have to take care of yourself in this role. And so for me, it's CrossFit. And if I don't have that 1 hour where I'm dedicating kind of a release from maybe the stress or the fast paced style of this career, then I get a little off kilter. And so I would say make sure that you're still giving yourself that 1 hour a day or time with your family or something that kind of lifts you out of the swell of chaos that can be medical device sales.
How long have you been doing CrossFit?
I started in 2020. So it's been about 6 years now.
Do you do it in the morning or after work?
It all depends. It was funny. I was telling some girl at my CrossFit gym this morning, she goes, I don't always see you at the same class. With medical device sales, it's whenever you can fit it in. So it's either 6 a.m., noon, 4:30. That's kind of the cool part about medical devices. It's a little bit more flexible than maybe a normal 9 to 5.
I do CrossFit in Columbus. It's called 11th Element. A guy named Graham Holmberg is my coach, and he won the games like 10 years ago, and he calls it 11th Element. And he's like, I love CrossFit, but I want to implement faith as well. And that's the 11th element. But I'm awkward. I'm like 6'7". I'm like big. I can't do some of the exercises, but it pushes me to do things I normally would never do. What is your favorite CrossFit workout?
I'm an endurance person. So I did triathlon at Liberty. And so anything you put box jumps, wall balls, running, anything like that, and I'm golden. But
endurance. Okay, what about this? What is one book, podcast, or person that has influenced your career the most?
I'll go person. So my dad was, he just retired about a year ago from sales. And he gave me two things that stuck out to me my whole career. He said, one, don't ever be a coin operated salesman. So sell to add value, like do something that actually adds value, not just what pays you the most. And then the second thing he would always say is that the minute you shake someone's hand, they're going to ask themselves, is this person going to contribute to my success or, potentially limit me? And so I always think about that when I shake an executive's hand. They're thinking, is this person going to make me successful?
Sounds like you have a good dad. That's great advice. Okay, you live in Chicago. Tell us something about Chicago that you enjoy. Why do you told me you like living in Chicago. Tell me about something in Chicago and maybe a restaurant that next time I'm taking my wife to Chicago, we need to go visit.
Yeah, okay. There's this restaurant called Portofino, and I'll tell you, get a reservation early in advance, but it's right on the Riverwalk and it is so much fun. They have great pizza. It's always absolutely packed.
We will have to keep that in mind. Okay, and one last question. What is one piece of advice that you would give someone who feels like they're behind in their career? They look at you, they look at your success, already #1 sales rep, and they're like, I'm not like Rachel. What is one piece of advice that you could give that person?
I always tell myself that, in 6 months to a year, everything in your life can look different. And so if you put in, like we talked about, those behaviors, in a matter of 6 months, you could transform what your life currently looks like. And that could go for a career, it could go for personal, for working out, for your faith, whatever it is. But I think that's we lose track of how fast it can be to actually have a reset. So that's my biggest piece of advice.
I like that. I think I heard a country song about that. Like she was talking about like 6 months later or something like that. But that's great advice.
Mm-hmm.
No, people get stuck. Like people get stuck in, I was talking to someone today, like they feel like they can't move. They may have to move because they're in this relationship, but they're not married and they kind of want medical sales and they're in all this debt and all these things. And you're right. 6 months later, a lot can change. Your career can change. Some of our audience needs to get rid of some relationships. Some of our audience needs to start hanging out with some new people. They may need to start getting. I've told this one guy, he was my first student. He was so discouraged. His fiance broke up with him because he wasn't that successful. She was, he wasn't. And I said, okay, your life can look differently. His fiance was, like a nurse practitioner. And I said, David, you need to start working out. And guess what? He started working out early. He started getting really disciplined. He got a medical sales job. He's already being promoted. I saw him. Yeah. He came to dinner. He was in scrubs, sharp, confident. The guy completely transformed. And that can happen to so many of us, right? Like the situation that we're in is not in. Rachel, you have provided a lot of help. I'm getting sidetracked right here, but thank you so much. And and we just really appreciate all the value that you have provided our audience. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
If you're trying to break into medical device or pharmaceutical sales, or maybe you're ready to reinvent yourself into a new specialty like oncology, our program, MedicalSalesU, can help.
I'm extremely grateful for Dave Starrett and his program, MedicalSalesU.
I'm now making $60,000 more than I was as a pharmacist.
I highly recommend the program. I just landed an incredible dream job.
Our members come from every background: nurses, pharmacists, teachers, athletes, and they're breaking in fast, averaging $151,875 in 11 and a half weeks. Many are earning over $200K. The industry is changing lives. You can change lives. Check us out, MedicalSalesU. Invest in yourself, and let's get you in the game.